But nevertheless, the issue is far more about how Iran can retaliate against the United States. Iran certainly cannot go toe-to-toe with the most powerful military on the planet. But it does have very powerful proxies in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, Iran is far more deeply entrenched in both of those countries and has far greater influence both over the political establishment, the official political government of Maliki, or the official government of Karzai, but also within the militias as well. In fact, part of the reason, to be perfectly frank, why we're even discussing the notion of getting out of Iraq, of removing all of our troops from that country, is because Iran has cooperated a lot in maintaining some kind of lid on their Shia proxies. Were we to actually bomb Iran, then those proxies, those dogs, would be set loose. So Iran can't attack us, in a traditional way, but it could attack directly American troops through its proxies in Iraq and Afghanistan, which would be a disaster. We can pretty much forget both the notion of a drawdown of troops in Iraq and the idea of a surge and stability in Afghanistan. Both of those very important foreign policy goals of the Obama administration would be jeopardized. So then the question is, well, why don't we just get Israel to do it for us? This is something that you hear all the time. In fact, the Jerusalem Post today, there was an article in which it said that Israel is already planning on bombing Iran. They're just waiting for Christmas to come and go. Christmas, of course, being a very important holiday in Israel for the Jews. This also is totally and completely false, fabricated, and impossible. Get it out of your minds. There are two very important reasons for this. One, Israel simply does not have the capability of doing a bombing raid on Iran without American support. Why do they need American support? Well, for two simple reasons. First, they have to fly over Iraq in order to get to Iran. Iraqi airspace is controlled by American troops. We are not about to let a foreign government simply fly over a region of airspace that we control without our permission. In fact, if you paid attention to what the former National Security Advisor Brzezinski said a little while ago, he came right out and very clearly said, hey, we need to make it very clear to the Israelis that if they even think about violating our airspace, because Iraq is our airspace, that we will shoot them down. Simple as that. Even if they're our allies, we cannot stand by and let one of our allies basically walk all over our sovereignty in that regard. And I mean sort of air sovereignty, not land sovereignty. Secondly, of course, those planes, once they finish bombing Iran, have to go back to Israel. And the only way to do that is to refuel in midair. And the only way to do that is through American planes. This was the whole issue with the Bush administration. The Israeli government actually brought their war plans to the Bush administration and asked both for permission to fly over Iraq and for permission to refuel their planes on the way back. And the Bush administration said no. So it's very unlikely that the Obama administration is going to say yes to that. So get that out of your minds. Israel has no military option with regard to Iran. It just likes to pretend it does. We don't have a military option in Iran. We just like to pretend that we do. By the way, going back to proxies, there's a very important reason why Iran, spends millions and millions of dollars boosting up Hezbollah and Hamas, because as far as it's concerned, that's its only form of retaliation against an Israeli strike. And as you all know, only recently, about a week ago, Iran finally launched a missile test that could possibly, this was the official line, it could possibly reach Israel. Well, congratulations, Iran, your weapons system has finally entered the 20th century. So the cost for both the United States and for Israel of a military attack far outweighs any possible benefits that they could get from it. And they both know this. They're not stupid. They know this. And when they talk about the sort of military option, it's mainly for domestic consumption with regard to Israel. But in the United States, it's more than anything else a means of sort of maintaining some kind of upper hand in any negotiations that will hopefully continue throughout the year. There is no military option with regard to Iran, period. So the other option that's brought up a lot is this issue of sanctions. Now, as you know, of course, we've had a sanctions regime in place in Iran for the last 3 decades. It is a sanctions regime that, like every single sanctions regime that we have used in almost any part of the world, has done absolutely nothing to change the political situation in Iran. On the contrary, if anything, it's only entrenched the current Iranian government in power. The sanctions haven't really ground the Iranian economy to a complete halt. They've had a major effect on Iran's economy. Make no mistake about that. But the truth is that we are now in a globalized era. This is not a unipolar world any longer. If you can't buy stuff from America, guess where you buy it from? China, Russia, India, Brazil, Venezuela. All these countries have massive trade relations with Iran. So they've managed more or less to brush off some of the more dire consequences that come from these sanctions, these 3 decades of sanctions. But at the same time, they have suffered. Now, when I say they, I mean Iranians have suffered. The real result of sanctions in Iran has been that at this point, about 1/3 or so of Iran's economy is black market. And that black market economy is run almost wholly by the Revolutionary Guard, an organization that we're going to talk a lot more about. So if traditional sanctions have failed, what we've been hearing a lot about is this notion of so-called crippling sanctions. Have you heard this phrase? It was first used by Secretary of State Clinton a few months back. And now it's become sort of, the most popular phrase to be tossed around in D.C. People will keep using it all the time. Well, we have the option of crippling sanctions. We have the option of crippling sanctions if negotiations don't work. Let me define precisely what crippling sanctions actually refers to. Iran, despite the fact that it sits on the 2nd largest supply of oil and natural gas on the planet, has such a deteriorating infrastructure that it simply cannot refine its own oil. In fact, it has to import some 40% of its gasoline. Let me tell you what it does. So it extracts this oil from the ground. It pays to extract the oil from the ground. It pays an enormous amount of money to ship that oil to places like Dubai or to Russia. Then it pays an enormous amount of money to have the oil actually refined and turned to gas. And then it pays an enormous amount of money to have that gas shipped back to Iran. And then, of course, it pays an enormous amount of money to subsidize that gas for its population so that you can buy gas in Iran at like 7-8 cents a liter. It's a huge revenue loss for Iran, but it's also absolutely necessary. I mean, it's like any developing country is desperate and totally reliant on oil to fuel its economy.